Hi, everyone. Welcome to Waste 360's Nothing Wasted podcast. On every episode, we invite the most interesting people in waste, recycling, and organics to sit down with us and chat candidly about their thoughts, their work, this unique industry, and so much more. So thanks for listening and enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Liz Bothwell from Waste 360 with Steve Menoff, Senior Vice President at Civil and Environmental Consultants. Welcome, Steve, and thanks for being here today.
It's great to be speaking with you. Thank you.
So before we dig into landfills, could you please share a little bit about your background? I know you've been doing this for 35 years, so would love to know how it all started.
Sure. Was that interesting choice of words, dig into landfills? Yeah, everybody who gets into the waste business generally has an interesting story. I grew up in New York. I went to Brooklyn Technical High School and Cooper Union to be a civil engineer and was actually interested in being a structural engineer. My senior design project, all the quote-unquote cool projects were already taken, designing bridges, stadiums, and things like that. And my advisor suggested my friend and I do a waste management plan for Westchester County, New York. So that was my initial step into the waste world. Didn't know much about it. Found it totally fascinating. Things that I never expected to learn about. Turned out one of my professors lived next door to the public works director for White Plains. He gave us a tour of the incinerator. We learned how they manage their waste, and we got into all sorts of waste management, processes that they were looking at. And you have to remember, this is back in the 1970s. I guess I have to say that out loud. And, people were looking to waste to energy and all sorts of conversion technologies. And here we are, in 2019, and landfills are the primary environmentally sound means of managing, municipal solid waste. So I think we've come a long way as an industry, but still using a lot of the same techniques. So after that, I went to graduate school at Northwestern in Chicago, and my advisor had a consulting agreement with FMC, who was trying to sell their air pollution control equipment to power plants. The air pollution equipment created scrubber sludge, flue gas desulfurization scrubber sludge, and that material needed to be disposed of. It needed to be landfilled. So I wound up doing my master's thesis on how to manage that waste in an effective manner in a landfill. The position with Waste Management in their engineering group at their corporate office, which at that time was in Oak Brook, Illinois. And I was at Waste for 10 years and stayed in the industry ever since. Probably half my career on the waste operating company side and half on the consulting side.
Well, that's amazing that you really started in waste management. It wasn't some sort of environmental study, and then you dove into it. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, now universities have classes, in solid waste management. Back then, it was kind of an afterthought. Maybe it was the last 2 sessions of a wastewater treatment class.
Wow, that's great. So let's get into landfills. And you're the perfect person to give our audience sort of a landfill 101 type of discussion. Many of our listeners are informed about the topic, but others are in other areas of the industry or new to the industry. So your insights will be most welcomed. So could you begin by sharing how landfills fit into the larger solid waste hierarchy?
Landfills have always played a prominent role in the cycle of waste management. They have gotten a bad reputation, in recent years because they're not part of the environmental agenda, but they still play a major role. Recycling, diversion, anaerobic digestion, all the things we're doing to take organics, out of the waste stream, recover metals, recover paper. There still is a residue that needs to be, managed in an environmentally sound way, and landfills do that. We've just been going through some recent meetings with United States EPA on some modifications that they're looking at to Subtitle D, which is the regulations that govern municipal solid waste landfills. And, it was through, several of the industry associations, National Waste and Recycling Association and Solid Waste Association of North America. And we spoke, to a lot of the members, operating companies, and no one could come up with any landfill since Subtitle D, in the early 1990s that has had an environmental problem. So lined landfills, composite lined landfills, which means a liner system composed of a synthetic plastic, for people who are not familiar with the terminology, geomembrane. For those who are used to the terminology, underlain by a compacted clay liner component. Those landfills have, served the public health well in that time period. So I think, as we move forward, we see a lot of new technologies that can process waste. I've seen one that turns waste into jet fuel, which is pretty exciting. Obviously, there's a lot of processes that, turn it into more conventional fuels and other uses. I still think there's always going to be a role for landfills. Waste to energy, in particular parts of the country like New England, where there's limited landfill capacity and it supports the cost of waste to energy. They're effective, but they still need disposal sites for the residue, for the ash that's generated. They still need disposal sites for the bypass, waste when they're not operating or, maintenance is being done.
Mm-hmm.
So I think landfills will continue to play a role in the overall scheme of solid waste management. They'll probably last longer as more and more waste is, pulled out on the front end. But I think they'll always be there. And I think the difficult thing for, a lot of, people to accept is this is a very environmentally sound manner to manage waste.
Sure. And like you said, since the rollout of Subtitle D in the 90s, it's pretty amazing that there haven't been any issues, because I was going to ask you if that, when it did roll out, if it changed landfills for good, and it certainly did.
It did. We've had engineering issues. We've come a long way in developing liner and leachate collection systems. Landfill gas collection and removal systems have evolved over that time period as we gain experience with different materials, different design parameters. But as far as environmental releases or any issues related to that, there hasn't been anything.
Great.
So I think it's a very good record. And I think EPA should be very, very proud about what they've accomplished with those regulations.
Definitely. And then can you tell us, Steve, what goes into the development of a landfill today? Could you walk us through those steps of actually proposing a landfill in the U.S.?
Wow, do you have about 10 years? In this day and age of and not in my backyard and all of those, movements, everything I said previously, notwithstanding being factual, nobody wants a landfill near them.
Right.
So citing a greenfield landfill in this day and age is very difficult. Citing an expansion to an existing landfill is difficult. There's a public process, a political process, if you will, that comes first in most states. Sometimes it's separate from the actual environmental regulatory agency process. Sometimes it's part of it. It depends on the state. But basically, you need to develop your entire project and go through a series of public meetings with the regulators, where you discuss your project, what it's going to entail, how it's going to impact the community. You have to look at traffic, line of sight. You already have houses there in the community. How is it going to affect them? Part of Subtitle D, there are a lot of technical criteria for where you can and can't, site a landfill, from a geologic, hydrogeologic, wetlands, those type of parameters. So once you get through those hoops and you actually design your disposal facility and go through the technical review process with the environmental agency in the state, there's still going to be a public input process, public hearings. They get to comment. Once a draft permit is put together in most states, it's put out for public comment, and then they have public hearings again. So it's a lengthy process, and I wasn't exaggerating by too much on the 10 years. We typically see it taking at least 5, somewhere between 5 and 10, to develop a new landfill, or as I said, even expand an existing facility. When you get through that process, I think it's fair to say that pretty much everyone's concerns have at least been addressed. Not everybody's going to go away happy. As I said, most people don't want a landfill in their community, but they also are the ones who are generating the waste that needs to be managed. And, that's a responsibility we have as a society to do that in a responsible way.
Right.
environmentally sound manner.
Definitely. And could you go over the different types of landfills?
Okay. Subtitle C, which is hazardous waste sites, actually was in 1984. Those regulations came out a number of years before Subtitle D, which is for the municipal solid waste landfills. They require double-lined landfills with a leachate detection system in between the two liner systems. When Subtitle D came out, even though a number of states at the time, and still do, have double liner systems because they basically adopted the Subtitle C regulations in some shape or form for municipal solid waste landfills. But when Subtitle D came out, they went with the single composite liner I described before with a leachate collection system above it. And that's what most states have right now. So that's the containment system for most landfills. There are other non-hazardous landfills besides municipal solid waste landfills. A lot of states refer them as industrial waste or residual waste. That includes, a lot of power plant waste, industrial sludges, waste products from manufacturing processes, and those are non-hazardous, industrial wastes. So they would not be, regulated by Subtitle C. They tend to fall under Subtitle D, and some states have different levels of, environmental requirements for those states, for those type of landfills rather. But they pretty much mimic the Subtitle D requirements for municipal solid waste landfills. There are also construction and demolition debris landfills. Historically, they have had less environmental requirements, but I think we're now seeing the need to have leachate collection and even gas management in those landfills because of the type of products that are, categorized as construction and demolition material. So they in most states, those landfills have requirements that are getting pretty similar to those for a Subtitle D landfill.
So you talked a little bit about the state of landfills today, how they're environmentally sound. On the other end of that, are we running out of land, and what solutions are helping with this issue?
We're not running out of land. We're running out of political acceptance for new landfills. I guess would be the polite way to put it.
Okay.
And, there's a lot of technologies out there to treat waste, to manage waste, to process waste. If you look at most of this country, we do have a lot of land and we do have a lot of landfill capacity. And it's a very cost-effective way to environmentally, manage the waste. So a lot of the technologies that people are quote unquote discovering now were, developed under EPA grants back in the 1970s. So I don't think it's a question of whether these technologies work. I think it's a matter of whether they're cost-effective or not, and does that justify doing those when there is an environmentally sound way of managing it? I think you look today at typical cycle of managing wastes. You have recycling, you have diversion. We're seeing a lot of the organic waste being pulled out of landfills. That significantly reduces the waste stream that goes to landfills. I think EPA data shows that pretty much about 50% of the solid waste generated in the U.S. now winds up in a landfill, as opposed to, I'm going to say 25, 30 years ago, that number was probably 85 or 90%. So I think we've made, large strides in increasing the different approaches we take to managing waste to extending the life of the landfills that we have. And, recovering waste through recycling and diversion. The question becomes, are there markets for those things? I know I've seen the news stories about China no longer accepting our recycled materials. So, that creates a problem in what to do with the materials you pull out of the landfills or you pull out before the waste goes to the landfills. But that said, I think we've taken a lot of measures that will extend the life of the existing landfills and reduce the requirement for how much more we need in the future.
Okay. And then could you please explain leachate and how it's handled at landfills and why it's important?
Sure. Leachate is the liquid that's generated at the bottom of a landfill. It's generated from a number of things. When a landfill is active, rain and storm water go into the landfill and mix with the waste and create this liquid that comes out at the bottom. There's a lot of waste streams that generate liquid of themselves. And this material is captured at the bottom. As I said, we have leachate collection systems right above the liner containment system at the bottom of the landfill. And a lot of things happen with this material depending on the quality of the leachate. So one scenario is direct discharge to a public sewer that goes to a publicly owned treatment plant. In a lot of cases, if the landfill is more remote, you'll have to truck that liquid to a treatment plant for treatment. So if I could tie a couple of things back together, we talked about recycling and diversion and how the amount of MSW going to the landfills is reduced. So as that number goes down, what we're seeing is a lot more industrial waste going to landfills, non-hazardous industrial waste. So what we're seeing is more sludges, industrial processing wastes being mixed with MSW in the landfills. And this has generated a leachate that has different characteristics, chemical composition, than traditional, municipal solid waste leachate. As a result, one thing we're seeing is pretreatment facilities at landfills that the landfill owner operator, is building and operating, so that he's pre-treating the leachate before it goes to a publicly owned, wastewater treatment plant, and it meets their acceptance criteria. In some instances, they're actually doing complete treatment on site at the landfill and then discharging the clean, liquid with a discharge permit. So depending on the quality of the leachate, there's a number of different ways in which it's being managed.
Okay, that makes sense. And then you talked a little bit about waste to energy. And is this happening at more the mature landfills in the U.S., or is it truly being used as a resource at all landfills?
Okay, so let's take a step back and talk about terminology. When I referred to waste to energy facilities before, I was talking about what historically were called incinerators, but now are what in fact waste to energy facilities, because we recover waste we recover energy that goes right into the power grid. Companies like Wheelabrator and Covant operate these facilities. And what I was saying before was those facilities, while they manage 85 to 90% of the waste, they still generate a residue that needs to be landfilled.
Uh-huh.
When what you're talking about, I believe, is landfill gas to energy systems, which we see at the vast majority of municipal solid waste landfills in the United States, where we put vertical wells, horizontal collector systems into the waste mass and recover the methane from it. And that methane can then be cleaned and processed, and again, could be fed into the grid in a variety of ways, either as gas or converted to electricity.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was asking. Thank you for clarifying.
We see that at a lot of landfills today. Probably the majority in the United States are now doing that. Very few are just, flaring off, which would be burning the gas. In all instances, most landfills are collecting gas, whether it's to recover it or to flare it off. That prevents odors. So it's just a matter of sound landfill management, is to manage gas and to manage leachate. One thing we've seen, in the past dozen years or so, is elevated temperature landfills as a result of, we don't really know, but a number of factors. Specific types of waste that the landfill has taken can react. Deeper landfills, wet landfills, those all seem to be contributing factors. And a lot smarter people than me are trying to do a better job of defining. But the leachate from those sites needs to be treated generally, specific treatment facility. I think what we're seeing is, to circle back, why leachate collection and gas collection and removal are both critical is those are the mechanisms by which heat, travels in landfills. So if we can remove the heat from landfills, we can prevent potential problems in landfills. So what you're seeing now, what I alluded to earlier was over, since Subtitle D, we've seen improvements in the design of liner systems, leachate collection systems, and landfill gas collection systems, as you're seeing much more significant infrastructure to remove leachate and gas from landfills in order to prevent heat from accumulating in those landfills.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And then, Steve, what are the fundamentals of accident prevention and safety at landfills?
Always be aware. Safety is a preeminent, concern of every landfill operating company that I have ever worked with, either working for those companies or as a consultant. You can't go into an office at a landfill or kitchen area at a landfill where the cabinets are not posted, plastered with safety information. Everybody on site is wearing protective equipment, hard hats, steel-toed, steel-shanked shoes, safety vests. Being visible is the most important thing. There have been accidents over the years that happen at landfills. People being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Heavy equipment, guy operating heavy equipment, he's got his ears plugged. He's not going to hear you yelling. You need to be visible. So I think the industry has done an incredible job from the safety perspective of making sure people are aware out there and dressed appropriately, know to keep their distance from equipment. So I couldn't stress more how important safety is, to the waste industry in general, but definitely at landfills.
Definitely, and that's great advice. So, Steve, how about regulations? Are these changing regularly, or any surprise inspections?
Well, those are two different topics.
Okay.
For the most part, municipal solid waste landfill regulations have been in place since the early 90s with Subtitle D. There were already states that had more stringent requirements. Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey come to mind. And the states that didn't implemented Subtitle D as their state regulations because ultimately the solid waste regs are a state program. EPA authorizes programs and then the states implement those regulations. So for the most part, those regulations, have been in place since the mid-90s in most states. What we've seen since then is different aspects. So leachate management, air emissions. So all the air regulations have been an ongoing process since then, and that has a direct effect on how we operate landfills and manage landfills to prevent, air emissions into the environment. So you're seeing people place, temporary cap if they don't get to, final grading to prevent emissions from leaving the landfill and going into the atmosphere. So that, to me, the air has been the biggest area that we've seen regulations since Subtitle D. From a landfill standpoint.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of things indirectly affect landfills. PFAS, which is a whole series of chemicals that are a result of manufacturing of a lot of things that we all use on a daily basis, is now beginning to show up in wastewater treatment plants as an issue, potential health issue. And if you trace it back upstream, a lot of it comes from landfills where they're taking in waste materials that have PFAS constituents in it. They're non-hazardous. Now, we're just beginning to understand what they are and how to manage them. So what we see is pushback from the treatment plants saying they can't accept the leachate if it has these constituents. And now we need to look at on-site pretreatment, in order to make this leachate acceptable for a wastewater treatment plant to accept it for final treatment.
Oh, interesting. We had Anne Germain on, and she mentioned that as well, and how the landfills are getting a bad name where PFAS comes in because a lot of us are exposed to it in our pots and pans and everyday environmental things that we're using and ingesting. And she said very little is actually coming from the landfill itself and the waste itself, even though obviously we're looking for solutions. It's sort of a bigger problem and has to happen at the front end of waste as well.
Well, I will completely defer to Anne on this topic. She's up to speed and knowledgeable than I am, but that's exactly the point I was trying to make is this is not a landfill regulation per se. Landfills are kind of getting caught in the middle. And what amazes me is we're kind of taking it from the tail end, whereas nobody's actually stopping manufacturers from using these materials.
Right.
I know several of them have voluntarily stopped using it, but in the meantime, Resolve Carpet Cleaner has them in it. Your microwave popcorn containers aligned with material with PFAS. So it's as I said, it's things we use every day.
Right.
And take it for granted and don't realize, and then we get all excited when some very small percentage is attributed to a landfill. The landfill didn't generate it and didn't create it.
Right, exactly. So, Steve, what are some ways that landfill operators can control costs? I know that's a big question.
Control costs is interesting. I think the biggest cost in a landfill is the construction cost.
Okay.
So you're looking at the geosynthetic components, which are the plastic materials, high density polyethylene, and similar materials that are used for the geomembrane liner system, for components of the drainage system, for pipes that are used both in leachate collection and wells for landfill gas collection. So you'll see the larger waste companies obviously have more purchasing power, and they can negotiate national agreements with their vendors to reduce costs for this, for those materials. The soil components, a lot of sites don't have the good soils on site to use either for the clay component of their liners or for their drainage material stone, so they need to import that material. Trying to find a reliable source within a reasonable distance, will help reduce costs. Construction management is always a key to being on schedule and on budget, so that's a huge factor.
I bet.
In managing your costs at the landfill. I mean, the basic components are, as I say, pretty standard. Everybody's, for the most part, using the same things. So I think it's a matter of purchasing power and location on the natural materials that you use if they're not on site. A fortunate site has borrow area on the property that they can use for daily cover and as part of the liner system in the final cover. That doesn't always happen though, and you need to purchase that material off site.
True, that makes sense. And then after a landfill is closed, what do you think should be done with the land?
That's an interesting question. Right now, the regulations require a 30-year post-closure period. Okay. There was a discussion of trying to expedite the biodegradation of the waste materials by adding liquids to the landfill. Over the past, say, dozen years, unfortunately, we found that there are some adverse things that come from adding liquid to landfills. As I said before, moisture seems to be at least a component of what leads to elevated temperature landfills. Mm-hmm. So the industry has kind of taken a step back from that. But the thought process there was to expedite, the biodegradation of the waste materials, and the landfill would stabilize, if you will, and then you could close it earlier. I don't know how likely that is from a regulatory standpoint. I think you need to continue to monitor, and when you reach a stable point, what we're really seeing is a lot of real estate development, I'll say commercial, retail type development in the buffer area around the landfill, and then more recreational use rather than structures on the actual landfill itself.
Okay.
From a long-term use, if we use the term landfill very loosely, I spent a number of years working in Chicago, and people, when there weren't landfills in the 1940s and 50s, they were dumps. People, would fill in construction excavations, and over time, that material would settle. It would biodegrade on its own and settle. And we found that you can build over it. There are a number of malls built over, these old sites. The gas has pretty much all, been expired, over the course of that time before any construction was done above the landfill. But they still put in, they'll put in a venting layer underneath from a safety perspective. if they put any structures, but there have not been any issues related, to the landfill, gas or any that type of thing.
Sure.
Settlement is usually the biggest issue when you build over an old landfill. Newer landfills are better operated, have better compaction, so you're going to get less settlement and less differential settlement. So from a construction standpoint, they would be better for that. But I think the concerns, the potential, health and safety concerns will probably limit it to development in the buffer zone. And then, like I say, parks, recreational areas, that type of development on the actual landfill itself.
Okay. So what do you think has changed the most in your 35-year career in the industry, whether it's landfills itself or anything else that you've witnessed?
I think viewing waste from being something to be discarded to potentially being a resource is probably the biggest change I've seen over that time frame. It manifests itself in different ways, whether it's through recycling, pulling organics out for anaerobic digestion to recover energy on the front end. I think the engineering involved in landfills has obviously progressed dramatically over that time frame. So I think these are fully engineered structures now. They're not just old excavations that people are filling in. So there's dramatic changes in that regard as well. But I think it's what we can do with waste. Like I said before, I know there's a project going on. You see a lot of TV commercials to use waste as jet fuel. To me, that's just amazing that that we can get to the point where we can efficiently and economically use waste products to be useful products for society and minimize the amount that we have to dispose of, and then do it in an environmentally sound way, which I think landfills will be a part of for a long time to come.
Yeah, I agree. And it is amazing what can be done now and what will be done with it. So what else do you think we should be paying attention to in the world of waste, recycling, and organics?
Well, we have to pay attention to it side of that equation. As you mentioned before, I think PFAS is probably the biggest concern right now that we're looking at as an industry from a landfill perspective, because if we can't find outlets for leachate treatment and disposal, that's going to have a huge cost impact. So again, that's one that we are reacting to as an industry. It's not the proactive positive side that we just spoke about a minute ago. To me, how we can recover energy and how we can recover useful products out of the waste that's disposed of, to me, is the positive thing looking forward that we want to do as an industry. But from a landfill engineer perspective, I think the biggest challenges are PFAS, in leachate, and what to do with that leachate, and then leachate and gas management in general, again, with the goal of making sure that we don't have situations develop in landfills where we'll have heat accumulation and potential problems related to that.
Right.
I think MSW landfills are not the issue of the concern. I think it's when we take industrial waste, we need to focus on how we manage those. Do they need to be monofilled, kept separate? Do they need to be solidified, stabilized, treated before they mix with MSW in the landfill cell? Those are the challenges, moving forward. I'd say for the first half of that time period, what we focused on as engineers was the envelope. How do we design the best liner systems? How do we design the best cover systems? And I think for the last at least 10 years, we as engineers in the waste industry have been focusing now on what goes in between and what goes in the landfill, because when it was just MSW, it really wasn't an issue. That it wasn't a concern from a stability issue or elevated temperature or any of those type of things. And now that we're seeing more industrial waste going into municipal solid waste landfills, what's actually in the landfill has become the issue that engineers are focusing on managing.
Right. That's a great way to put it. And then what advice would you give to professionals considering entering this fabulous industry?
I consider myself incredibly fortunate. I've been in this business 35 years or so, and I have never been bored for a day. It's always changing. I was fortunate enough to work at Waste Management for 10 years, as I mentioned before, in the 80s, and there were so many changes. When you do your yearly review and it's like, what do you want to be doing 5 years from now? The answer was generally some job that doesn't exist right now
Wow.
because things were changing so fast. And I just find that, incredibly interesting, fascinating, challenging. I know we're not as sexy perhaps as we were back then as an industry. I can tell you it's a great field. I think it's a great industry. We have some great companies, both on the operating side, on the technical side, the consulting engineering side. I've been fortunate to work on both sides of the industry in that regard. I think it's a great career challenge, for someone with an engineering degree. I just hope that more and more, young people graduating from programs with those type of degrees want to get into the business because we need them.
Right.
It's an interesting change. When I was starting in this business, you would go to technical conferences and there wouldn't be any older people. And now at Global Waste or some of the conferences we go to, we look around and we go, there's a lot of gray hair here. And so that there's a change there. We really need to see more young people getting into the industry. And like I said, I think it's every bit as exciting and challenging as it was when I got into it. And I realize the world's changed. I don't know that it's our industry that's less exciting. I think there's just more options out there that people are considering when they get out of school.
Definitely. There is an exciting side to this in the sense that I think there's a real focus on sustainability and the environment. So I guess the hope is that more people, more smart, younger people will be attracted to this and see it as a step for sort of the greater environmental concern and that they can have an impact and help at this stage. So
I think people need to, I think that's an excellent point. We're the good guys. I know sometimes landfills are positioned as the bad guys. We are the environmental movement. We are the sustainability movement.
Right.
We're the ones actually, doing something to help manage the environment and protect it in a responsible way.
Exactly. And have been doing it since before it was cool, right?
Exactly.
So, Steve, what keeps you busy outside of work?
My hobby. So my second job, I'm a tennis official. My daughter played tennis as a junior and actually in college. And somebody thought it would be a great idea if I became a tennis umpire.
That's great.
Not sure why this was a great idea, but it's pretty consuming. So I used to do professional events. I've done John McEnroe and Jimmy Connors matches in the past, but now I just do collegiate. I really enjoy it, and it actually gives me a break in the summer because the season is basically January till the end of May, and then we have a couple of tournaments in the fall. So I get the summer off, which you don't when you're doing pro events. So I really enjoy that. It's relaxing, and people ask me how I manage clients and work with clients. It's like after you've been on court with John McEnroe, clients really aren't that bad.
Exactly. Everything seems easier, I'm sure. Oh, that's awesome. What a great hobby.
I have no complaints.
That's great.
Great industry. I feel very fortunate to have spent my career in it.
Oh, I bet. And how can listeners hear more from you or more from CEC?
People can reach out to me directly if they have any questions about the industry. I'd be happy to help.
Oh, great. That's fantastic. And Steve, thank you so much. This has been great and really informative, and I know our listeners will get a lot out of this. So thanks a million for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome. I appreciate the opportunity. It was great speaking with you.
You too. Thanks, Steve. I'll talk with you soon.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, Liz.